I have base coated the cloak with a combination of phthalo blue, a smidge of white, and some burnt umber just to calm down the phthalo blue. Now we can come in with blue tint, which is white with a little bit of blue in it, and start with our folds. And this is done wet into wet. And the folds are placed and then blended out to create, the form that is necessary. So for example, this entire section gets much lighter. It's on the side of the light, following the flow of the form that's underneath, and it will start to create that first little bit of a fold. As I mentioned before, there are many different types of folds, and this particular first fold that we're working on, this is called I'd call it a diaper fold. Just interesting type because it pretty much just drapes from one point, but it drapes away. And it also has, especially the sections down in this area, where it hangs from 2 points, from her knee and then traveling up. So understanding the form underneath, which is the knee, and then the different types of draping will help us paint this. So taking each section little by little, we're painting to create the folds and the form. The trick to doing this is just doing it wet into wet. Keeping one side of the fold. If you want it to pleat, you won't blend it out. If you want it to just bend, such as this, then you'll blend out both sides. You want it to be the lightest on the top, and then just fade. The darks are created by not putting any light paint in those areas, or hardly any light paint. And if need be, if it gets too light in areas that are meant to be dark, then we'll go back and recreate our dark areas. And just as in our other sections, this is just that first stage. Just, unfortunately we cannot do it all at once. This is just getting the fabric going. But already I can see some of that, the drape, some of the different characteristics, seeing some of the form underneath. I like in this section where it appears as if her dress is curving up and folding back onto itself. Now when I base coated this, I don't know if you noticed, but it was not very smooth. It did not need to be because of all of this work that goes over the top. In some cases, such as here, you can make the fabric come to a point. What you also have to think about when you're doing fabric is, what kind of fabric is this? Does it drape easily? This fabric appears really not thick or not thin, and it seems to drape rather easily. But in some cases, we can make it, again, come to a point where it drapes. I did, off camera, base in her knitting with just burnt umber plus a little bit of red, because that was omitted before. This fabric comes in and disappears because this fabric goes on top of it. Now up in this section, we're starting to see some types of folds that are called pipe draping, where, especially over in here, where it's just coming off of a single point and looks very round and tubular. Over in this area, we want to have just an illusion of draping because this is our darker side. If you do not work as fast as I do, you could just lay down some paint in one small section. In other words, don't base the whole section in, because I did thin it out a little bit with some of the paint thinner, and the paint thinner does evaporate. So if you do not work this quickly, you might want to do section by section instead of one big area, because it will evaporate and make it a little bit more difficult. But again, this is done wet into wet. It just really helps with the movement of the paint. And it frankly is much easier. There's a dark area up in here that I have lost, so that is where I'm going to come in with black and reestablish. We will be putting in other colors into this when it's dry. We'll be dry brushing in violets and stronger highlights. I must have just stopped basing this in here. I'll just do that real quick. My paint is starting to set up and not wanting to really cooperate or take any more paint. So I might be getting toward the end here. I think I will come back in with black and just add this on top. You have to experiment a little bit with how much paint you use on the top. You do use quite a bit when you drop these folds in. Just quite a bit of the blue tint, and you come back with the black. Anytime you work, I guess, wet into wet, and you put paint on top, it has to be heavier and thicker. In making the folds, not always just rounded folds, but having some breaks in the fold and different shapes. Much more interesting. And the same with on the back side. Now there are different types of folds that were used throughout history. I thought it was interesting that in the Gothic time period they used quite a bit of the zigzag fold, and that's where a fold is a tubular fold, but then it zigzags and creates a Z shape coming back onto itself. And we don't have really a zigzag in this particular piece. Another type was in the Greek and Roman time. They used a lot of the pipe, which is this, and then a lot of the spiral, where because the bodies were always twisting and turning, you would see a lot of the fabric that was spiraling and twisting and turning. Then of course in the Renaissance the fabric was quite form-fitting, and the idea in the Renaissance was showing as much knowledge of human anatomy as possible, so the form was emphasized through the fabric. Then in the Baroque period, which was a reaction to the Renaissance, of course, the fabric almost took on a life of its own, and it worked to conceal the figure. So interesting that throughout time there's been almost like a way to depict fabric that was popular in that time period for various reasons. We have quite a bit of wet here. Again, your option, you can dry this, and then we're going to continue on with the rest of the cloth. The first thing I'm going to do on her skirt, shawl, etc. is come in and strengthen the darks, and coming in with black that has just a touch of the blue in it so it doesn't look totally dead. Need some stronger darks, and this entire side needs to be darker, as does her shoulder area, because her head is actually casting a shadow onto the cloak. Shadows follow the form of the receiver, and so be sure that the shadows are coming down following that shape. In other words, if you have a fold here, the shadow goes down into the fold. If you don't have folds on this side, you can establish them now. But the whole idea is this entire section just needs to be darker. The underneath needs to be quite dark, again because it's away from the light. And I'm somewhat strengthening the shadow here. And I think I'll go ahead and just, while I have this on my brush, cast the shadow from her onto the bench. But strengthening individual folds and definitely strengthening this right side away from the light and this underneath area. Again, just as on the face, the darks are glazed on and the lights will put on in a thick impasto way. Always set your brush down where you want it to be the darkest, and that's sometimes why it may appear that I'm flitting, But if I've just loaded my brush, I look for a very dark area to augment first. Then I know that the paint is running out. I can tell there's still a lot of paint on this brush, so I'm just moving about trying to see what would be best served. And then as the paint starts to run out, like it's starting to now, then I'll come to maybe some subtle areas, such as this outside. So I'm really not flitting. I'm moving about, knowing how much paint is on my brush. And it can make you a very efficient painter if you work in that way. Adding some pucker folds in here at this moment. I think this cloak now has much more volume because before we treated it individually with the individual folds, and now we're treating it as a big unit. And noticing that this is the dark side, a little bit lighter side, and just where are those strong darks. Coming back in and accentuating folds. And again, my brush is fully loaded, so I'm looking for a very dark spot. Sometimes what happens is I can't remember why I loaded it in the first place, but usually it comes back to me. It almost seems like with these darks that we've placed that there's not a lot that we need to do with lights. But let's go ahead and dry brush on just a few lights just to really kick this over the edge. You have to decide if you have a roll or fabric that's laying on top, or if it's a pleat. So for example, if it's a roll, such as in here, the highlight will go in the center. But then if it's a fold back, as in here, the light section will go just right on that outside edge. Again, I have that fully loaded brush. So with blue tint, I'm just adding where the light values would go. And in some cases, maybe just a very subtle little tiny bit of a highlight. And in other cases, a lot of light right on the edge, which will definitely look like it's somewhat of a hard edge. Light values right in the center, making a cone shape. Will look like softly draping fabric. In this case, slightly in from the outside edge, gives it the look of a hem. Let's say that your fabric just looks it doesn't look blue, or it looks very blotchy. You can repeat the initial process that we did. You can coat the entire thing with a very thin layer of phthalo blue, plus a little bit of light gray or white, and burnt umber to tone it, and start the whole process over again. In addition to using just the blue tint as a highlight, you can come in with yellow tint on the light side in areas that we want it to be quite light, which would be the top of her knee is quite light, and it's on the side of the light. You can also come in with the light violet, pinkish color from the background, and that will add just a lovely accent. And it might look like some of that atmosphere is being projected onto the outfit that she's wearing. I hope you can appreciate that everything that you put down should have a purpose, whether it's to reflect some color, create a specific kind of fold, be warm because it's on the side of the light. And then your cloth will just have so much more form and ripples because you're using it, all these lights and darks, with a purpose. Let's work a little bit on her knitting. We've kind of ignored that. I'm going to coat it with, again, with Burnt Umber plus red. You can even, where it meets her arm on both sides, blend just a little bit into the arm. Then it'll look as if the arm is resting on top. It won't look so separated. What we have coming in now with raw sienna plus just a little bit of white are the ribs that you get when you knit and purl. Looks like she might actually be making a sock. So it does have kind of a cylinder look to it. And then coming in with Burnt Umber plus black and creating those dark divisions in between. And then we can come in and make it a little bit lighter as usual on the side of the light. Just using raw sienna plus white. And actually we can come in and add a little bit of a contact shadow. Some on the left side, but a fair amount on this, on the side where the shadow would be cast. Just every little bit that you add makes a difference. Just makes it a little bit more realistic. Now she has her knitting.